almost too heavy for the riser. Good evening. Now please sit back and relax, and I'll try and paint you a picture of life in medieval York at the time when the mystery plays came about. For an elite few, life was rich, exclusive, colourful. For the majority, it was simply hard work. In medieval York, this life-work balance came to be challenged by a new and organised middle class, made up of skilled craftsmen and merchants. They would put pay to the control of society by effete French noble lords with their fancy Latin ways. The words of a famous guide to the universe would have certainly rang true for the men and women on the streets of medieval York. It is an important and popular fact that things are not always what they seem. Well, they would have done if they'd ever heard of Douglas Adams. But anyway, life for people of York was not simple. It was complicated, full of reference, rules, and above all, mysteries. How the natural world was created, how a person should live their lives, how things were made. As England's second city, York was the home in the north of the country to royalty, archbishops, and abbots. It was the stage from which campaigns against rebellious Scottish lords was launched. At eye level, the cityscape was one of narrow streets and low timber buildings. Look up to the heavens, and the spires and towers of spectacular stone religious buildings towered above. Within 400 metres of where we now sit and stand, two of the greatest churches in Europe, the Metropolitan Cathedral of St. Peter and the Benedictine Abbey of St. Mary's, were located, dwarfing some 50 other churches, chapels, monasteries, and nunneries in this glorious city. These buildings were constant reminders of the power and glory of God on earth. These buildings, no they weren't, I've already said that. Unlike today, they were not open places for local people and visitors to the city. You couldn't simply wander in and have a look round. Their locked doors, behind high stone walls and formidable oak gates, would have kept even the most determined party of French schoolchildren out. Yet for most of the medieval period, it was what went on behind those doors that dictated the rhythm and the understanding of medieval life. St. Mary's Abbey, here in York, was the largest, richest, and most powerful monastic institution in the north of England. Its abbot rivaled the archbishop, and at times even the king. Yet its mission was one of prayer, solitude, and charity. Although a closed order of men, the abbey's gates were places for dispensing alms to the poor. The monks owned whole communities, whole villages, lived off their rents, dispensed justice to them in their own courts, and looked after their souls. The upper classes made donations of land, villages, churches, and money to the monastery. These benefactions allowed the monks to create a great architectural masterpiece in the form of the Abbey Church, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Benefactors liked to see their actions commemorated by commissioning works of art and chapels at which the monks could pray for their souls. They themselves were often commemorated in statues, such as our friend here. A rather gorgeous little piece, minus his colour, of course, and also his head, but clutching the church that he paid for. Such acts of generosity and corporate sponsorship eased the donor's passage through purgatory to heaven. Of course, it's still true. Corporate sponsorship of a community drama event will get you to heaven much quicker. So fear not, get your wallets out, please. The Abbey Church, which will form the backdrop to the mystery plays next year, was not a simple, plain stone edifice, but a richly painted and intricately decorated monument to God. The interior was a glorious stage set in which elaborate processions, acts of worship were carried out, often with great theatricality and drama. Even everyday parish churches were not made of bare stone and whitewashed plaster, but full of vivid paintings, inspirational sculpture, and illuminating stained glass windows. Within the great church buildings, the elaborate liturgy of the medieval church was delivered using smoke, rising platforms, tricks, choreography, and stage direction. It was in these surroundings that answers about life could be found. These lessons were often delivered using complex rites and rituals, mysteries, in Latin, a language that few spoke, and behind screens that obscured the priest from view. It very much was a very private affair. To the populace and the parish communities of York, who were mostly literate, it was the imagery and drama of these mysteries and the authority of the actors who performed them carried with them that so impressed and intrigued. God's magnificence was not the only subject for such splendour and grandeur. Men and women who had lived the most extraordinary, miraculous lives were, after their death, turned into saints to be revered and worshipped. Their lives were used as examples of how everyone should live their lives. Remember that. How you should live your life, like a saint. No alcohol, no sex, just nice, simple living. Their holy days were celebrated in towns and villages across the land with fairs, festivals, and feasts. Not somber, teetotal, contemplative occasions, but often rowdy, drunken, and very colourful events. A bit like we'd like the mystery plays to be next year. Their tombs were turned into fabulous shrines and became the focus for popular pilgrimages. People would travel, often on foot, across Europe to visit the most important shrines, the greatest of them at Santiago de Compostela and in Rome itself. But for the people of York, their very own minster had 3 shrines to the city's patron saint. In York, we do things bigger and better. We leave an impression. We had 3 saints to St. William of York. His miracles, well, his miracles were many. Many people came to... It's very dry in here. I've lost my place now. His miracles were many. But his most famous was when he was alive and serving as archbishop in the 12th century, a little bit before the mystery plays. He saved thousands of York citizens from harm when Ouse Bridge, then made of timber, collapsed under the weight of the thronged crowds welcoming him to York after 7 years of exile. Across York, altars, the focus of religious worship in churches, were erected in his name. They were covered in the finest sculpture and paintings. To give you an idea of the splendour of this alabaster panel depicting Christ being elevated into heaven was a centrepiece of one of these altars. And I think one of the exciting things so far in seeing the early pictures of the last mystery plays is the colour in them. We're so used to bare stone walls and quite plain architecture, when actually the medieval period is full of colour. If you have a look, I mean, it is absolutely, it's full of red, it's full of gold, it's full of pink. It's a very vivid and colourful world. This is carved by one member of the guild. This is an alabaster panel carved by perhaps the York master in alabaster. Such was the quality of craftsmen that came to the city. We generated absolutely the best works of art anywhere. These people grew the wealth and reputation of the city and created for us a new middle class. Their ever-growing influence gained York a measure of economic independence from the king. The citizens of this prosperous and cosmopolitan city were proud, independent, and even rebellious. The majority of York's communities worked hard, often in really unsavoury pursuits, to earn the money simply to live. The poorest relied on the church, the charity of the church that dominated the streets of the city. This small locket, which I hold before you, is perhaps the finest piece of medieval jewellery anywhere in this country. However, it's probably exactly the opposite of the mystery plays. This jewel is exclusive, it's elitist, it's made for a single person's consumption. This is the Midland jewel, perhaps belonging to Richard III's mother. It's covered with secret codes, with imagery, words in Latin, words in Hebrew, magic words. Only a certain person who was really well educated would ever perhaps understand it, except for the person who made it and commissioned it, who would wear it close to her skin. This was meant to be kept and hidden, well away from the prying eyes of everybody else on the streets of medieval York. However, in late medieval York, a popular movement from the streets, demanding access and rights, was challenging this form of exclusive art, of living, exclusive worship. The craftsmen and merchants of the middle class had gained increasingly more control, influence, and wealth. The church, with its towering spires and gleaming architecture as an institution, had lost some of its shine with the local people and communities. Religion, however, still ruled. Although craft and trade organisations known as guilds or mysteries start to appear, they're not purely secular bodies. Yes, they control the learning, dissemination, and practicing of the skills of their trade, but they also fulfill a charitable role in education, healthcare, and looking after the poor, once the domain purely of the Latin-speaking monks and clergy. The art of the elite, with their complex theatre in foreign languages of Latin and French, was out of the reach of most people and seemed somewhat effete. The middle classes, together with the masses, demanded and championed new art forms in their common language, English, that was full of energy and contained new music and drama. These new sights and sounds, very strange to the traditional medieval establishment, let alone our modern ears at times. For instance, the gittin, played by our little angel here, was described by one writer at the time as producing a sound akin to a strangled chicken. You'll have to wait till next year, perhaps, to find out what it really sounds like. The York cycle of mystery plays was, or is, the most famous and significant product of this world. Gradually, over this period, religious drama was leaving the confines of greater and lesser churches and making its way onto the streets. Plays in English became more popular and were increasingly used to celebrate the most important festivals, Easter and Christmas. They became a popular way of interpreting the history of the world from creation to the Day of Judgment. In York, 48 plays were recorded and strung together to make the world-famous York cycle of mystery plays. Their authors are particularly unknown, but the link with the old religious orders had not disappeared, for they are most likely to have been men of the cloth, perhaps even monks of St. Mary Abbey itself. The plays were to be performed on the Feast of Corpus Christi, the third Thursday after Trinity Sunday, and one of the most important Christian festivals in the calendar. This new order of craft guilds took on the responsibility for producing and delivering these often really quite lavish plays. Different guilds presented highly appropriate stories. The shipwrights, the building of the ark, and the butchers, the death of Christ. The players were the guild members, and possibly a few local extras as well. Even perhaps our friend here, the benefactress from St. Mary's Abbey. So perhaps volunteer, become part of it, get yourself recorded in stone. 500 years' time, somebody will be here going, you won't believe it, Ted Smith, he was there. Statues will be created in your honour for being part of it. The plays at places around the streets of the city took place. Each guild took a play and performed it from the back of a wagon or a pageant. These wagons were theatres on wheels, containing stage, sets, backdrops, and actors. The guild members, everyday people, acted out the messages contained within the plays to large and often rowdy audiences. Thank you for being quiet. The play's writers and directors were skillful and produced plays that have stood the test of time. They appealed to the man and the woman on the street and yet contained clever subtleties that would have been recognisable to even the poorest person. These plays revolutionised how the story of creation and the life of Christ were taught. Gone were the days of stuffy Latin lessons with self-righteous priests. The mystery plays had arrived, making celebrations on the Feast of Corpus Christi perhaps the greatest day in the calendar of medieval